They laughed at Nigeria's currency crash. For months, analysts around the world, journalists in Western capitals, and even local critics had pointed to the Nigerian Naira as a symbol of mismanagement, of economic fragility, and of a country overwhelmed by inflation, debt, and dependence on imports. Images of Nigerians struggling with rising food prices, collapsing purchasing power, and long queues at banks were used as proof that Africa's most populous nation had reached a breaking point. Many thought Nigeria would never recover from this crisis. But what happened next surprised the very people who mocked it. Out of the depths of its currency collapse, Nigeria began to reimagine its place in the global economy, turning a period of vulnerability into one of its most radical transformations in decades. The story of how that unfolded is not just about numbers on a chart. It is about political will, strategic alliances, and a society tired of being underestimated. When the Naira fell sharply against the dollar in late 2023 and 2024, Nigeria seemed cornered. Import costs soared, fuel subsidies were removed, food became painfully expensive, and ordinary families bore the brunt of policies meant to stabilize the economy. Yet behind the scenes, a broader strategy was forming. Nigeria's leadership knew that it could not simply defend the Naira by burning through foreign reserves or by artificially propping it up. That was the mistake of the past. Instead, it needed to build a foundation strong enough to make the currency resilient. This meant rethinking trade, expanding local industries, renegotiating international partnerships, and, most importantly, shifting away from a system that had tied Nigeria's fate to the dominance of the dollar. Critics laughed when officials announced that Nigeria would deepen its engagement with China, Russia, and other members of the BRICS bloc. Many said that it was impossible to replace the dollar in such a short period. But step by step, Nigeria began doing exactly that. Oil contracts, long denominated exclusively in dollars, were restructured so that certain deals were settled in yuan, rubles, or naira itself. This was not immediate or universal, but even the symbolic shift sent ripples through financial markets. Nigeria, Africa's biggest oil producer, was signaling that it no longer intended to be chained entirely to dollar liquidity. At the same time, Nigeria expanded its currency swap agreements with China and launched direct settlement mechanisms to avoid dollar conversion. On the domestic front, something else was happening. For years, Nigeria had been mocked for its over-reliance on imports, particularly for items that could be produced locally. The currency crash forced a reckoning. Businesses and consumers, suddenly unable to afford imported goods, turned reluctantly but decisively toward local alternatives. Nigerian manufacturers, once stifled by the flood of cheaper foreign products, found themselves with a growing demand base. Industries like textiles, cement, agriculture, and even technology saw an unexpected boom. Farmers began selling more within the country as imports of rice and wheat became unsustainable. Startups launched fintech platforms to help ordinary Nigerians cope with inflation, while also enabling cross-border trade with digital solutions. Out of necessity, innovation flourished. They laughed at the currency crash, but they did not anticipate how it would accelerate Nigeria's integration with Africa's wider economic awakening. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, often criticized as being too slow to take off, suddenly became central to Nigeria's strategy. By pushing trade within Africa, Nigeria could bypass some of the pressure created by global currency volatility. Deals were signed with Ghana, South Africa, and Kenya to increase direct Naira settlements for goods. Nigeria also began spearheading discussions on creating a pan-African payment system that would allow cross-border transactions without reliance on Western intermediaries. This was not just about easing trade, it was about sovereignty. For decades, African economies had been tied to currencies and institutions beyond their control. Now Nigeria was showing that crisis could be the catalyst for liberation. Of course, it was not easy. Inflation continued to bite. Protests erupted. Families suffered through months of instability. But while the outside world mocked, Nigeria was recalibrating. Its central bank began tightening oversight of the parallel exchange market, implementing digital reforms and building new currency reserves through gold acquisitions and direct commodity trade. Nigeria quietly increased its gold reserves, buying from local miners and entering swap arrangements with allies. These moves, often overlooked in the daily news cycle, strengthened confidence that the Naira could one day stand more firmly on its own. What shocked many was the global reaction. As Nigeria deepened ties with BRICS nations and built alternatives to the dollar, Western financial institutions warned of long-term risks. But for many in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, Nigeria's defiance was inspiring. Commentators in South America compared it to their own struggles against IMF dependency. In parts of Asia, Nigeria's resilience was seen as part of a broader push by the Global South to rewire international finance. In African capitals, leaders began asking if Nigeria could begin detaching from dollar supremacy after a crash, why couldn't they? The laughter that had followed Nigeria's collapse began to fade, replaced with grudging respect, and in some cases, fear. This fear was not irrational. For decades, the dollar's dominance has been a tool of influence, enabling sanctions, controlling trade flows, and shaping global markets. If Nigeria, a country of over 220 million people with massive oil and gas reserves, successfully built mechanisms to bypass the dollar, the precedent would be enormous. Already, other African nations started exploring direct settlement in local currencies. Some joined Nigeria in discussing regional reserves backed by African commodities. The idea of an African monetary independence, long dismissed as unrealistic, was gaining traction. Meanwhile, Nigeria's diaspora became an unexpected force in this transformation. Remittances, a crucial source of foreign exchange, had long been channeled through dollar-denominated systems. With new fintech platforms and government incentives, more Nigerians abroad began sending money directly in Naira-linked digital wallets. This not only saved fees but also reduced dollar dependency. The diaspora, often a target of ridicule during Nigeria's hard times, suddenly became one of its lifelines. As the months rolled on, evidence mounted that the currency crash had sparked more than hardship. It had triggered a wave of self-reliance and reorientation. Western media, once quick to highlight Nigeria's failure, began publishing cautious articles about a surprising recovery. Investment firms that had written off Nigerian markets started reconsidering. China and Russia, sensing opportunity, deepened infrastructure and energy investments. Even Middle Eastern sovereign funds stepped in, betting that Nigeria's reforms would yield long-term growth. What truly silenced the laughter, however, was Nigeria's growing influence in global diplomacy. At energy summits, Nigerian representatives spoke not as beggars, but as negotiators, shaping the future of resource trade. At African Union meetings, Nigeria pushed for stronger financial independence. At the UN, its diplomats linked economic sovereignty to global justice. Suddenly, a country that had been mocked for its collapsing currency was setting the terms of conversation about the future of money in the global South. The story of Nigeria's currency crash, therefore, is not just about economics. It is about resilience, reinvention, and the refusal to remain trapped by old structures. Yes, ordinary Nigerians suffered. Yes, mistakes were made. But in the ashes of crisis, new strategies were born. They laughed when the Naira fell, but they are no longer laughing now. Nigeria's path is far from smooth, but its determination to reclaim economic sovereignty has already shifted global calculations. In the end, what happened in Nigeria is a reminder of a deeper truth. Sometimes collapse is not the end, but the beginning of transformation. The world may have underestimated Nigeria, but Nigerians themselves, through pain and persistence, are proving that a crash can also be a rebirth. The same currency that once symbolized weakness has become the symbol of a nation learning to define its own destiny, on its own terms, in a world where power is slowly but surely tilting away from those who once laughed the loudest.